and Twitter. This evening, Books and Books, in collaboration with the University of Miami Center for the Humanities, is very pleased to welcome Professor Mary Lindemann and her new book, The Merchant Republics. Here to introduce Professor Lindemann, please welcome to the podium the director of the center, Professor Mihoko Suzuki.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Books and Books for hosting us again. This is our first event for the semester and the first book talk, and I'm really happy to see that it's really standing room only, an auspicious beginning. And we have my colleague and friend, Mary Lindemann, as our first speaker this semester of the 4 book talks that we'll be presenting here. And next week, I just want to tell you that we have a special event by John Meacham, one of the Pulitzer Prizes celebration on the art of leadership. And that'll take place next Tuesday, January 26th at 7 p.m. at Gusman Concert Hall. And you can still register for that on our website. So today, I'm very happy to ask Professor Hugh Thomas, who is a current fellow at the center, who's been a board member, who's been a really important figure for the Center for the Humanities, as has Mary, and he will introduce his colleague, Mary Lindemann, tonight.
Thanks, Mihoko. Scientists talk about cloning as something that's coming in the future, but I'm pretty sure it's already happened. Because the only way I can figure out how Mary Lindemann gets so much done if there's at least 2 and probably 3 of her. We first start with administration. To be a mediocre chair takes an enormous amount of work. To be an excellent chair takes incredible amounts of time. Admittedly, Mary does re-energize herself by using, shall we say, colorful language from time to time. But nonetheless, she also needs a great deal of time. Teaching, she does carefully planned undergraduate courses, graduate seminars that involve huge amounts of reading, huge amounts of commentary. She does enormous amounts of academic service beyond the university, serving on editorial boards, serving on prize committees. Right now, she's one of 3 editors of Early Modern Woman. The other 2 are here. A new, well, not that new journal, but important journal. She is currently vice president and will soon be president of the German Studies Association. She also manages to give dinner parties for the department, go to opera, and so forth. And she also keeps on producing scholarship. Now, as many of you know, Mary has already had an extraordinary academic career. She started at the University of Cincinnati, where she was mentored by our mutual colleague, Guido Ruggiero, here in the audience. Since one of the things that Guido has taught all of us is the fine art of academic insults, I'm tempted to say that Mary has had a great career despite his mentoring, although that would be unfair. In any case, she has had a great career. A few signs of her scholarly stature are the number of, well, I'll start off with the number of prestigious fellowships she's won, various awards from the NEH, the Guggenheim, DAD Fellowship, Fulbright, stints at the Shelley Cullum Davis Center at Princeton, the Herzog August Bibliothek, the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies, the Wellcome Center in London, and the Flemish Academic Center for Science and the Arts. Here at UM, she was an early recipient of a Cooper Fellowship in 2007. She's presented over 60 papers, including many in Germany, not surprisingly, but also the UK, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Slovenia, not one of the more common venues for scholarly papers. She's published 40 articles. She has 2 edited collections and another on the way. 6 books, some of which have been translated into various languages and some of which have had second editions. She's currently working on 2 more books, including an ambitious one on the impact of incessant warfare in the German lands in the 17th century. Her scholarship has established her as one of the leading specialists in early modern Germany in the world, but her scholarship is not just in Germany, as the book under discussion, as you'll see, indicates. She has a prominent position in the field of medical history as one of the people modernizing an old-fashioned field, but her interests and expertise range far beyond that. A book, for instance, on patriots and paupers in Hamburg, or Liaisons dangereuses, Sex, Law, and Diplomacy in the Age of Frederick the Great, and now the book on merchant republics. But to go into any real detail on her accomplishments would demand that we all have clones. So we could send the clones off to hearing the boring introduction while the rest of us enjoy the talk itself. The current talk is on her most recent published book, The Merchant Republics, Amsterdam, Antwerp, and Hamburg, 1648 to 1790. And this book is already getting attention. One reviewer describes it as rich and erudite. Another one speaks of riveting tales and notes that it, quote, deals a fatal blow to the old thesis that in the perception of early modern thinkers, commerce and virtue were essentially at odds. So clearly, even within a short time of its publication, getting attention. So I ask you all to please join me in welcoming Mary Lindemann.
One of the problems of a good introduction is you are immediately worried about whether you're going to live up to it. I'd like to thank Books and Books for staging this tonight, and for Miyoko Suzuki for being the inspiration behind the Books and Books talks. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming out on a cold, bitterly cold night to sit in a rather warm room. I was just sitting next to my friend Ann Cruz, and Ann says, what about the dates? Are you going to tell us what the dates mean of your book? And I'm there, well, I was going to tell you about what the other things of my book meant, why merchant republics, and why Hamburg, and why Amsterdam, and why Antwerp. But sometimes historians have blind spots, and the dates are so obvious to me that I didn't even think about this. But I'll start with that. The book starts in 1648, which is the end of the 30 Years' War, and it makes a significant change in how people how administrations worked. And even more importantly than that, it also means that there's a tremendous increase in bureaucratization, and a tremendous increase also in the amount of paper that you actually have to work with. 1790 is rather the end of the old regime in all three cities, with the Revolutionary Wars, and then, of course, later on, the Napoleonic occupation. Satisfied, Anne? Okay. The title of my book, Merchant Republics, may quite justifiably lead you to suspect, or even fear, an economic history, filled with charts, stuffed with numbers, rich with complicated graphs tracing profits and loss, sort of the early modern equivalent of the GNP, or even a cliometric equation. Relax. That's not what it's about. Rather, it describes and analyzes the self-understanding, social practices, and the political culture of three important merchant republics, the commercial emporia of Amsterdam, Hamburg, and Antwerp. Its prosaic title, I think it is a prosaic title, belies a provocative agenda. I offer nothing less than a reevaluation of how historians have viewed republics and merchants, and the relationship between the two over the course of the long 18th century. And in the book, I take some time to lay out why these cities are so important commercially. But I'd like to try to do that very, very quickly, just by showing you, a couple of pictures. The first picture is one of early 18th century Hamburg, and you immediately see the importance of shipping. This is from the harbor. The importance of shipping and the importance of water. Then, I'll get this really. Wait a minute, I'm going the wrong direction. Antwerp, this is an earlier picture of Antwerp, and it's a very pretty picture. But with this picture too, you see the centrality of water surrounding the city. And all three of these cities, particularly, however, Hamburg and Antwerp, have very, very advantageous geographic locations. But there's something else to be said for these cities. They're not, and the story is not only about merchants, it's not only about shipping, it's also about politics. And this picture, which shows the central marketplace in Hamburg, also shows in the middle of the picture the exchange, and then over, let me make sure I'm looking at the right, over this building is the city hall. And the close proximity of the market, the exchange, the stock exchange, and the city hall really encapsulates in one picture what the book is about, the interaction between politics, merchants, and trade. Okay. The Amsterdam Exchange is even more famous, and it's even bigger. And I have two pictures of the Amsterdam Exchange, this one, and then even a more expansive one. They're very interesting because if you look at the first one, you can see a picture that is actually pretty accurate in its perspective. But the picture that they liked to portray is this one, which widens the exchange out to make it look even more impressive, and the perspective suggests coming out to the widening world. And that was actually the propaganda value of this picture. Both halves of my title, then, Merchant and Republic, however, still require some explanation. The combined term is one of those famous metaphorical empty vessels into which various historical vintages have been poured. Not everyone in these three cities was a merchant, of course. Not all inhabitants lived from commerce or possessed clear connections to the mercantile or financial worlds. Yet a merchant republic was what has been called in this context for 16th century Antwerp a community of commerce, a polity that achieved consensus around and identified itself with trade. That understanding glued the community together despite many differences and tensions. So this is a fairly long story, and over the course of nearly 400 pages, I compare the fates of these three cities during a span of almost 150 years, arguing that they shared a political culture in which politics and economics, mercantile precepts, and Republican ideals flowed together in ways that forcefully shaped a common civic existence and identity. Tonight I want to focus on one of these, which I think is a useful way of looking at the merchant republics to understand what they are about. Tonight I want to focus on identity by examining two key figures in this tripartite story: the merchant republican and his opposite number, the imposter, who played Mr. Hyde to the merchant's Dr. Jekyll. First of all, the merchant republican. For many scholars, as well as for many early modern observers, the merchant republican was a contradiction in terms. A series of major works, in particular that of J.G.A. Pocock, John God-awful Pocock, in his magisterial The Machiavellian Moment, postulated a quarrel between virtue and commerce, which Hugh so kindly mentioned. Political virtues of self-sacrifice for the good of the res publica, and in its service preserved republican systems. Contemporary political observers and their historians agree that a major cause of the decline of virtue and civic commitment was mercantile greed. This interpretation, however, seems to me particularly unsuited as a useful analytical category for anyone seeking to understand mercantile centers like Amsterdam, Antwerp, and Hamburg. In these merchant republics, commerce was never seen as antithetical to republicanism, nor erosive of virtue, despite repeated fulminations of moralists. Debates over the ills of commerce and commerce's ability to enervate republicanism necessarily loomed less large in these aggressively proud mercantile cities. Merchants and the merchant bankers, who were the early ancestors of today's financiers, have not always enjoyed a good press, even in cities built on trade. Traditionally, actually since Roman times, merchants were viewed as fundamentally untrustworthy, morally vacuous creatures. Reevaluations of merchants as beneficial to the state began to sound, and then only feebly, very late in the 17th century. A fundamental reconceptualization of commerce from being a public hazard to a modern conception of commerce as free private exchange naturally redounding to the civic good was a late 18th century phenomenon. That transformation, of course, happened earlier and struck deeper roots in the mercantile republics than in in the merchant republics than in territorial states like France. Certainly, the negativity attached to mercantile pursuits never sounded stridently in Amsterdam, Antwerp, and Hamburg when it sounded at all. Thus, in the merchant republics, even long before the end of the 18th century, the merchant was viewed not as a threat to republicanism and political independence, but as the perfect model of a responsible republican citizen. Hamburg's most famous spectatorial publication, one built on Addison and Steele's Spectator, called The Patriot, crafted a fictional merchant named Pasitulus and endowed him with all the virtues of a good citizen in his public, private, and business lives. Pasitulus represented the ideal. Although cosmopolitan and well-traveled, he had avoided the cavalier's tour. On his journeys, he gathered useful knowledge rather than acquiring a few foreign oaths and compliments or new gestures and fashions. Maybe I should develop some foreign oaths. He settled back into Hamburg, where he quickly assumed many public offices voluntarily, that is, without being paid for them, all of which he conducted, as they said, sensibly, judiciously, and diligently. He sounds very dull, actually, as he conducted his business. No one, the Patriot concluded, has ever had a better and more honest understanding of true freedom than our fine Pasitulus, a man who knows and values the differences between the real affluence of a citizen and that of a noble or courtly way of life. He was, in short, the unshakable support of the public good. So typically here, commentators counterparted citizens and urban civic culture with nobles and court society, much to the latter's detriment. Most scholars now consider that characterizations of that nobility as lazy, violent, poorly educated, and shallow that many 17th and 18th century commentators drew so sharply, think Candide, were more in tune with moralists' wishes than a reflection of reality. In the merchant republics, however, there's a shadow here, these biased portraits remain useful counter-images as they assisted in fashioning urban and civic identities. It was a counterpart. The effeminate, flighty, arrogant court noble drew scathing commentary, but the greatest scorn was not poured on these nobles themselves, but on citizens who admired and imitated nobility's not so admirable qualities. The young Herr von Franzenaar, Monsieur French Fool, oops, gone the wrong way again. I'm going the wrong way. Well, Monsieur French Fool enjoyed the breathless and worthless adoration of a woman named Frau Venteuse, Madame Windy, or better yet, Madame Flatulence. The Patriot, however, saw only an aping of customs that contact with a totally corrupted nation. France, when one was speaking of clothing, and Italy was when one was speaking of sex. An association with fool-headed people at court had created. Despite his travels, French Fool had acquired no real command of language, but merely peppered his babblings with 1,000 pardieu and ma foi. He had become fully superficial. A wig, an embroidered coat, a well-cut pocket, all counted more with him than true wisdom. Instead of being a free German, he had become a slave to foreign passions. The same rhetoric sounded in the Dutch press. In praising the solid mercantile values, one critic took aim at the whole concept of the bon ton and linked its flaws and vices with French customs. It is a foreign intruder and the corrupter of good morals, prescribes turning day into night, and overturns all regularity and order in life. The mornings, while most will remain asleep, is wasted by the rest, and especially by the ladies, in English, with their déjeuner and toilette, the afternoon by the dîner, and the evening with an opera, comédie, assemblée, concert, or ball that reaches well into the wee hours. A godless, loose-living bon-tonism took the blame for, among a laundry list of woes, the erosion of good bourgeois values, and more expansively, the demise of Dutch prosperity. Noble-like habits bore equal responsibility for a newly fashionable lack of marital fidelity, a general disrespect for the sanctity of the wedded state, sodomy, and love between women. But no one was more vilified than the impoverished noble, or one with a fictitious or dubious title. While family fathers and mothers worried about the impecunious nobles who sought to seduce their daughters, or called their sons out in duels, or embroiled them in gambling, they worried even more about the thefts that impostors carried out of money. The false Prince of Albania looks perfectly harmless, doesn't he? The false Prince of Albania is a very good example of this, and he's sort of one of my stars. When I was doing this book, I stumbled over incredible characters. And the one thing you learn when you spend a large amount of time, and I've spent a lot of time, in the archives, is that these stories and these very bizarre people, are not uncommon. They're really very, very common, and you find a lot of them. This false prince, Stepan Annibale, or Count Zanovich as he was usually known, worked all sorts of miraculous economic scams in Amsterdam. He and his brother Premislo were really nobles. They had been born into a very minor nobility in Albania. Their father was an impoverished nobleman, and the two brothers produced very little money and very questionable titles. They tried to make their living as professional gamblers, which succeeded for a while. If you've ever read Barry Lyndon, you understand the phenomenon. And when that didn't really work, they tried some other things. They washed up in Amsterdam, or Annibale washed up in Amsterdam in 1772 with another ruse in mind. He titled himself the High Dynast of the Montenegrin Mountains. You know, the titles are wonderful. He ended up playing cards with two bankers named Chommel and Jordan. And Chommel and Jordan, very respectable Dutch burghers, became very enamored of Annibale. And in exchange for a note that was due in 3 years in the amount of 3,500 piastres, and another one for 10,000 piastres, signed by a mysterious Lord Lincoln, they advanced him 27,000 gulden, a lot of money, in cash and in diamonds. And Zanovich offered the most solemn assurances, he said, that he had a ship that was laden with Greek wine and it was about to come into port, and he would sign that ship over to him. Now, rather obviously, that ship never existed. There was a note for a fair amount of money over the signature of Lord Lincoln, that he had actually, Annibale, had actually won from Lord Lincoln at the famous Lamberti Cafe in Florence. It had already been cashed. And so when Chommel and Jordan tried to cash it, the guy said, no, this has already been cashed. Amazingly, they said to Zanovich, what's going on here? And he says, it's a mistake. There's some problem here. I need to go to Italy to try to straighten things out. And so they say, well, do you think that's a good idea? Oh, yes, it's a very good idea. So he goes to Italy. They give him letters of introduction. And while in Italy, he meets another person who is a major banker, businessman, and he presents him with someone else. And he says, this is Nikolai Provich. He is the son of a very famous Venetian banking family. And you should advance him some money. And they advance, and this consul in Rome advances him some money. And then they write off his debts. But Provich is none other than Annibale's brother, and doesn't have any money either. So pretty soon this whole house of cards just comes tumbling down, because it's built on fake bills of exchange, it's built on promissory notes, and Annibale is moving around and trying to convince different people. The amazing thing is that these very, very smart bankers, Chommel and Jordan, believe him time after time after time. He takes them for something like 150,000 gulden before they begin to say, maybe this isn't working out quite the way it's supposed to be working out. So Zanovich and his brother abscond, they leave Amsterdam, and they finally resurface in Paris in 1774. He's now calling himself the Italian Count Saluzzo. Finally, however, in Amsterdam, he's recognized by a clerk of Chommel and Jordan, and they have him thrown into prison. And that's when it becomes really kind of sad, because the day after he's thrown into prison, the next morning, the turnkey, goes to the door, opens the door, and he's lying there dead. He has bitten his veins open with his teeth, and he has bled to death. He's 35 years old. His body was displayed at the local hospital, where hundreds viewed it, and thousands followed him to the grave. Annibale, however, is not without his talents. He is actually very much a Casanova figure. Besides being a crook and a scoundrel and a cheat and a humbug, he is also a man of letters. and he's written about 6 or 7 books. And so he has this very strange overlap. Well, it's not a strange overlap. It's a very common overlap between this very, very shady existence and a very, very close link with the Republic of Letters. Stepan Annibali's story is one of the most sensational and extraordinary of a century that positively throbbed with scandals. Few noble impostors could rival his coups or his ability to slither out of the grasp of the law and his creditors. His adventures, if unique in their boldness, were hardly unique in their general features. Even if we accept, in P.T. Barnum's immortal phrase, that there's a sucker born every minute, the ease with which impostors gulled bankers and merchants of exceptional business acumen seems astonishing. But is it? What can we identify in the culture of these merchant republics, if not exclusively there, that facilitated impostors and their gambits? A whole series of circumstances favored them. One of the most important was the fluidity of the economic world and of the innovative financial practices that were being developed and implemented in the 17th and 18th centuries, and which I treat at considerable length in the book, as well as with topics of bankruptcy, speculation, the development of a stock market. Both situations fostered a mood conducive to economic wildcatting. In this climate, merchants and businessmen became increasingly uncertain and increasingly nervous about the tenets of what may be termed economic morality, business ethics, and trust more generally. Hand in glove with worries about the new slipperiness of the economic world ran condemnations of luxury and foreign ways, even if reality rarely mirrored that rhetoric. One major reason, therefore, that rogues and ruffles proliferated in these years, therefore, lies in the shifting character of the economic and financial worlds. The late 17th and early 18th centuries teemed with get-rich-quick schemes and projectors, of whom the Scot John Law was only the most famous or infamous. Like Law, many noble impostors migrated frequently because mobility served their subterfuge as well. Cities, and especially those large enough to foster anonymity and to encourage at least some acceptance of strangers, multiplied their opportunities. Speculation in stocks. The first stocks are traded on the Amsterdam market in 1605. The vastly accelerated use of bills of exchange, and especially the bubble and windy trades of the late 1600s and early 1700s, the famous South Sea bubble and Mississippi scheme, where paper fortunes stacked up literally overnight and then scattered just as rapidly, opened room for impostors to work their magic. And, oops, going the wrong way again. This is a Hogarth print on the South Sea Company. And the South Sea Company sold stock, and it's not a very good picture, I'm sorry. But you can see the kind of interest that there was in buying stock in the South Sea Company. And all sorts of people got involved. And it was a tremendous crash. This was also true. Here's a caricature of a selling shares in the South Sea Company in Amsterdam. You know, this rather strange-looking little creature who's got a very big pencil and his stock book in his hand, and he's crying out, you know, like you would sell fish on the street. He's crying out to sell these stocks. And then the reality of the Mississippi Paradise in Biloxi, Mississippi, which is not much of a paradise. However, this picture is actually not that bad. The Mississippi Paradise, or the Mississippi settlements, were really pretty horrible things. And these little huts here don't look too appealing, but you have this nice little boat, and you have you probably can't see it too well. You have this really nicely dressed guy, and there's all this propaganda that comes out in illustrations. All the propaganda that comes out in illustrations that is used to sell this stock. And this all collapses, and a lot of people lose a lot of money, and it's a fairly large scandal. Bills of exchange and notes drawn on distant banks lubricated this European-wide economy, an economy based in the merchant republics and other urban financial centers such as London and Paris. Their claims and their methods varied little, in fact, from those methods respectable merchants use daily. And when you think of Annibale uses bills of exchange or letters of exchange. He uses stocks, he uses bonds. He talks about these ventures he has that all parallel what perfectly honest merchants are doing every day. And there's really no reason to particularly to disbelieve him, except, of course, that he's complete and utter fraud. These guys added, in truth, a bit of flash, fancy clothes, jewels, and perhaps a uniform, and often a strong whiff of the exotic, puffing themselves as princes from far-off lands, such as Albania. But at base, they formed as much a part of economic culture in these decades as investors in the Bank of England or holders of India Company's stock. The difference was elusive because both types could engage. Both types did engage in many of the same activities. In the merchant republics, therefore, of Amsterdam, Antwerp, and Hamburg, imposture possessed yet another valence. It was an intensely political one. Not all merchants, of course, proved paragons of either economic or political virtue. Big surprise. Yet transparency in business and politics did not exist only in prescriptive literature. It flooded into political pamphleteering, into political debate, and into records investigating criminal activities. It was equally resonant economically. Imposture, as the obverse of guilelessness, formed a major issue in the business dealings of the day. The merchant republican was therefore quite a real presence, and for his city, quite a real benefit. To dissolve him into his two component parts promised only political impotence and economic decline. Thank you. Sure. I know most of them. I know who not to ask. Questions? This is what I say to my students. Questions? Hi, is that David back there?
So one can't help think that you wrote this book under the shadow of 2008, that in the world of financial and investment innovation, for every Michael Bloomberg honorarian who mixes advanced finance and civic mindedness, there is somebody out there inventing CDOs and AIGs and things of that sort. Is that part of the argument that with the innovation and expansion of this kind of commercial activity, that there's a flip side or underside that combines extreme naivete with ambition and fraudulence?
You want a quick answer? Yes. It's actually very, very, very true. And the interesting thing is that you have these what we would call crooks and perfectly respectable people doing the same things. And there's a great deal of commentary. There's a great deal of commentary that's moralist. But I don't think there's only a moralist commentary about, trying to get rich quick, and we're losing all the old values, and our fathers did it differently, and trying to get rich quick is not a good thing. You should slowly build up your wealth and blah, blah, blah. But nobody can resist the siren song of making money quickly. And so everybody speculates, and there's more and more speculation not only in goods, but also in money. Everybody gambles on what we would today call futures. And the reason they do it is because a lot of people make a lot of money. And people are a little nervous about this. And there's this wonderful set of commentaries about how merchants are supposed to act. And there's kind of the stuff you'd expect. You should be honest in your dealings, fair. You should not try to cheat people, all that kind of stuff. But then there's a whole other set of commentary that says, well, a good merchant can't be too honest. If he's too honest, he's not going to make money. And so you have to be a little bit clever. For example, if you're trying to sell cloth, you show a bolt of cloth. You don't have to unravel the whole thing and show the person that it's moldy in the middle. You just show them the piece of cloth, and if they buy it, it's not your problem to tell them that, the rest of the bolt is not like what you see right here. Or, they also often use the image of gambling, of cards. And they say, bluffing and, winking and that's all fine. Drawing bottoms and palming cards, that's not fine. So they try to navigate between misdirecting and outright deceit. And it becomes very tortured at times because, you really can't do it. And 2008, I was just talking to somebody, and this person asked me, when did you start doing the research on this book? And I said, 1997. And he said I was 1 year old. And I thought, oh, ouch. Frank.
Hi, thank you for talking about this. I guess one of my questions has to do with, I certainly think of Amsterdam as a merchant republic, and I could extend that to Antwerp without too much trouble, but I don't know much about Hamburg, and I wondered if you could talk about the extent to which the situation in Hamburg, politically, economically, culturally, was very similar to, and also significant ways in which it might have differed from the other two?
The interesting thing about it is Hamburg is actually the most perfect type of a merchant republic, much more so than Antwerp, and more so than Amsterdam. We all know about Amsterdam, and the secondary literature and the writing on Amsterdam is enormous. And why I call Hamburg the perfect example is because in Hamburg, merchants rule. They have legally defined positions in the city council. They have a majority of the seats in the city council, and they still engage in active trade. What happens in Amsterdam over the course of the period I'm talking about is you end up with people who are still linked to trade, their families still trade, but they've become a professional governing body. In Antwerp, Antwerp's the outlier here. It's sort of a foil to the other two in many respects. It's still a merchant republic, but in Antwerp, there are many nobles who actually sit in the city council. It is also part of first the Spanish and then the Austrian Netherlands, so it is less independent. So the kind of what you expect, that Amsterdam is going to be the model and the other ones are going to sort of trail along behind, is not really true. Hamburg's actually the most perfect. And in that sense, Hamburg is also the only one that enters the 19th century still as an independent state. Amsterdam is incorporated into the new Dutch kingdom, and of course then also, so is Antwerp, and it becomes part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands until 1830. Yeah, George.
I'm curious. I went to Krakow recently, and it's part of the Hanseatic League, and led by Hamburg, in particular, led by the German city-states.
Lübeck.
And again, my memory of this is a little murky, but they talked about how as the market more and more dominated the trade in Krakow, how this led to a proliferation of crime and all kinds of vice. So I think physically it moved from outside of the castle, the market moved out. So in other words, it moved outside of the domain of the monarchy or the aristocracy, and moved out into the more, again, rough and tumble of the market. And they did talk about an increase in social vice and whatnot and crime. I don't know. I mean, that's what's my recollection of it.
Is the question, is there the similar kind of increase of crime?
Yeah, I'm looking for the social, the broader social impacts of this.
Well, one of the, should I say this? One of the problems with the book is that I don't talk too much about, I talk about the merchant classes, how they perceive their city and how they present their city. That might not be how everybody in the city sees the city. Although in each one of these cities, the laboring classes really do live from commerce. And they live from commerce very, very clearly. It's hard to tell. I mean, it's very difficult to figure out what's going on with crime. Certainly, Amsterdam has a bit of an unsavory reputation for brothels. Hamburg as well. Hamburg today has a very unsavory reputation. Well, it's not unsavory because it's very well regulated. Antwerp, there's also a religious difference here. I mean, Hamburg is Lutheran. Antwerp is Catholic. And Amsterdam is kind of mixed. I mean, Amsterdam is technically Calvinist, but it has a fairly large Catholic population. Hamburg and Amsterdam have large Jewish populations. Antwerp, much, much smaller Jewish population. And so, it's very, very hard to say whether these cities are centers of vice or not. Every city has an underbelly. These are big cities for the most part. Amsterdam has 200,000 people. Hamburg, at the time I'm talking about it, grows from about 60,000 to 130,000. Antwerp is much smaller, 40 to 60,000. So yeah, there's an underbelly. But exactly what the dimensions of that are and whether these people actually feel like they're living in a dangerous city, I don't know. I mean, and it's like, I live in Coconut Grove. If you look at the map of Coconut Grove and you look at crime coloring, Coconut Grove has a very high crime rate. That's because people are stealing somebody's Maserati. But nobody's, I hope I'm saying this right, nobody's getting stabbed every day. Other parts of the city, people are getting stabbed every day, but nobody's stealing a Maserati. So it's what do we mean by crime? The more goods there are, of course, the more possibilities for crime. I saw another hand. Yes.
There was no acceptance of this city-state or Republican by everyone. Because in Amsterdam there was an attempt to overthrow the government by people who wanted the nobility back, who wanted the House of Orange to be in charge. So the House of Orange in the Dutch Republic was relegated to leading the army and the navy, the defense of the country. So there were people opposed to this, but I think that was mostly the working class.
And that's where it gets really interesting and difficult. A republic in the 18th century is kind of a weird animal. It's considered, it's militarily weak. None of these cities have any kind of military to speak of. It doesn't seem to have a strong government. The modern government seems to be monarchy. Hamburg is in a very interesting position because it's sort of caught between several different powers, and that sort of helps it because you can't allow anybody else to take the city. So, other people will step in. Prussia will step in to prevent Hamburg being taken over from the Danes. The Danes will step in to prevent Hamburg being taken over from somebody else. So there's some advantage to being somebody that nobody can afford somebody else to have. In Amsterdam, you're absolutely right. There's a conflict in the Dutch Republic between the stadtholder and the republics, the cities. The cities, however, have one really great advantage, in Holland anyway, in the province of Holland. They are filthy rich, and they need, and the stadtholder need the money. But they do try. In 1650, in 1748, and 1760s, they do really try, the stadtholder does try to take Amsterdam unsuccessfully. And the tension, sometimes we see it as a very clear clash. It's not. It's the historiography now says it's really much, there's more cooperation than clash. But republics are considered kind of weird animals. And each one of these republics, Antwerp is much less of a republic than the other two. Their wealth is a real advantage to them. And having money is always good, right? Yeah.
Was there much of a difference in the discourse along with this kind of discourse on luxury? Was there like a discourse on like food? Like the French were kind of cast as having this kind of
they eat frogs.
Food
They eat frogs. Yeah, bad. There's the luxury debate is very, very interesting because in the merchant republics in most of Europe by the 18th century, the battle over luxury has been won. Consumerism is a reality. It's a reality that is seen as a positive good. Okay, there's always moralists who say, people are wearing too many pearls and all the morals are declining and blah, blah, blah. But that kind of agonistic hand-wringing is so typical no matter where you look for it that you can practically ignore it. Everybody is wringing their hands about how the old values have declined, probably since Adam and Eve were in Eden or out of Eden. So there's a lot of moralism about this. And the picture I've presented is about nobles and republicans is also a little bit too dichotomous because there's one of the reasons the nobility is seen as so dangerous is because many of the republicans are really very seduced by it. And what you see is sort of a convergence of the noble ideal and the citizen ideal, the burgher ideal, into what a friend of mine calls the new ideal of the gentleman. And so it's not really quite as, not controversial, as confrontational as I've presented. Professor Thomas.
Do any of the successful merchants try to move into the nobility from these cities?
That's interesting. In Amsterdam, they do. Because one of the ways to really make your fortune in Amsterdam is to get a position in either the Spanish Habsburg or the Austrian Habsburg government, into the whole government. In Amsterdam, there's a lot of talk about how the people who become the regents, the people who govern in Amsterdam, how they try to move into the nobility. And that was a historiographic tendency about 30 years ago. Since then, people point out that even people who build big homes and take on titles like Von are really still very closely linked to a bourgeois, I don't want to say bourgeois, to a merchant lifestyle. In other words, they still invest. Often, if they have 3 sons, one's a lawyer, typical, because that's a way to move ahead in government. One's a merchant, maybe one studies theology, but there's always pretty clear links. And when they get kicked out of government, and that goes back to your statement, when the Stadtholder comes in and removes people from government, the people that have been removed go right back into trade, work in trade for a while, and when the wheel turns again and they get back in government, then they get back in government. Kunal?
So I guess I wanted to go back to the reference to Pocock, right?
Oh, yeah,
So
sure.
to the extent that the book is supposed to be, some kind of engagement / rethinking of the story that he tells, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about whether there is a kind of Republican theory generated within these republics, and also how the sort of Harringtonians and their successors in the 18th century actually spoke about these republics.
Okay, Pocock argued, wrote about a grand intellectual tradition that reached from the Middle Ages until the end of the 18th century, that saw Republican virtue as very much damaged by people who followed the money trail, who pursued commerce, because by the pursuit of commerce you became dependent, and once you became dependent, you didn't sacrifice yourself, blah, blah, blah. That has been rather vigorously questioned, because people who have looked at continental examples compared to the Anglo-Saxon examples have not seen the same kind of intellectual debate. Not only talking about the republics themselves and what they do. And so people like Jonathan Israel have argued, not only Jonathan Israel, also Weinhard Meinhard, have argued that Pocock is really talking about an Anglo-Saxon phenomenon, not about a phenomenon that is really European Republican. And a lot of people 25 years ago picked up the Pocockian idea and applied it to Europe, where it doesn't quite fit. Because these merchant republics are not, there's just too much reality and too much rhetoric about the virtues of a mercantile lifestyle as a good citizen to really sustain a Pocockian narrative. On the other hand, your other question is a very interesting one. Is there a well-articulated Republican platform? No. None of these Republicans have major theorists of republicanism. It's a little bit true for, Amsterdam is actually better than the other two. In Amsterdam, there's Peter Delacourt, and then there's, I've forgotten his name, somebody else in the 18th century. And they do talk about Republican ideals and Republican government, and they theorize a little bit. But the theory and the writings come out at particular moments in time. For example, in 1650, when Amsterdam is being threatened by the Stadtholder, Peter Delacourt comes out and says, we have the Stadtholder who's threatening our republicanism. So it's usually a response to an actual political situation rather than a grand intellectual tradition. Now, that might also be true of the Harringtons of the world as well. But it goes in a different direction. Oh, Ms. Cruz.
Well, I'm more familiar with the kinds of merchants that existed in Spain and Genoa, for instance. But I'm wondering if, in fact, there were those familial networks that linked these three cities, perhaps.
There's connections. There's pretty strong connections between Amsterdam and Hamburg. Less so with Antwerp, because Antwerp's Catholic. And Antwerp's part of the Spanish and Austrian Netherlands, of course, as you well know. So probably less so. The really interesting thing with the Jews, because in both Amsterdam and Hamburg, they're very, very closely connected. And also, the other thing about this is, I talk about, if you remember my title, it's The Merchant Republics, the definite article. I've been called on the carpet about that, and somebody says, your title should really be Some Merchant Republics. And I thought, oh, what a lousy title. It's like some aspects of. So I said, no, I'm not going to do that. So I have a section at the end where I do talk about other cities fit the pattern, too. And indeed, there would be a very interesting book to be written, which I'm not going to write, but there would be an interesting book to be written to talk about other merchant republics. You could talk about Leghorn or Livorno, you could talk about Baltimore, you could talk about Bordeaux, you could talk about Philadelphia, you could talk about some places in South America. You could talk about these places as merchant republics, too. They don't have the same political tradition, but there's still something to this idea of these republics that are merchants. In Germany, earlier you had cities like Leipzig and Augsburg, the free imperial cities. They too were some kind of merchant republic. But I'm interested in this long 18th century. And those cities have really lost much of their importance by the 18th century. The one exception, I guess, is Frankfurt. But Frankfurt is also by no means as economically powerful as Hamburg. Hamburg's a monster.
Why did the Hansa cities not develop into merchant republics?
The Hansa cities, that's very interesting. I was at a conference on the Hansa cities in Paris this summer. And the Hansa really dissolves as a political entity in 1669. Yeah, 1669, when they have the last meeting. Then the three rump cities, Bremen, Hamburg, and Lübeck, continue the Hansa, but the Hansa really has died by then. The Hansa republicanism was never as, was never as pronounced in the cities, where merchants, if you look at the Hansa cities, and the Hansa cities, there's a lot of Hansa cities. It's a very long list, and they're organized in circles. Most of those cities did not have.
Help is on the way.
I'm going to continue. God is mad at me. Oh, that was nice. Most of those cities did not have as well developed of a merchant republican tradition, of a governing tradition. And many of them were much smaller. The Hansa was this really interesting kind of melange of cities. Better harbors. That's an interesting, one of the arguments that is often made about these three cities is they're geographically blessed. Hamburg has a great river and a great hinterland. It didn't have a good harbor. It had to use Texel. And it does have a good river system, however. Amsterdam is a little bit different in that way. Antwerp has a great harbor and a great river, but it was closed down after 1585. Not quite as completely as people believe, but it was closed down. Hamburg really has the Elbe, and the Elbe is a great advantage because it reaches, all the way into Czechoslovakia, and it is a navigable river. And so it's much better off than either of the two. But it's false to think in terms of geographic determinism. It's not only the geography that makes these cities great, it's the combination of this mercantile republicanism.
The Dutch Republic attracted many people from Germany, Hamburg.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm supposed to shut up.
You can answer that one.
I didn't. Is there a question?
Okay, well, please join me in thanking Mary. So you may.
Okay, folks, so we have the books for sale at the counter in the front room over there. Mary's going to be signing there at the table to the left of the screen, and please give another hand for Professor Lindemann. Thanks very much.
Thank you.